Welcome back to our YouTube channel, Mundelein Church of the Nazarene, and episode 29 of our journey through the New Testament. Last week, we talked about the book of James. And so we have a question that's popped up about my talking about where James says we're not justified by faith alone. We've had people say, wait a minute, that sounds different. Well, James 2:24. If you read, it says, we are justified not by faith alone, but by works. This is the exact phrase that made Luther dislike James so much. We forget the battle that Luther was fighting. So, Luther was fighting this battle in the church in the Middle Ages, that there were people who were selling fire insurance after the house was on fire. Or if your spouse, if your parent, if someone that was close to you had died and you wanted to ensure that they got their eternal reward, you could do so. And Tetzel was selling something called indulgences. So after they died, if you were to buy something or give a big offering to the church and do some service, you could guarantee that the church would then give grace to your departed that would be sure that they went to their eternal reward. It was to this background that Luther steps in and went, no, wait a minute. You can't do this after the fact. You're justified by faith. He was right. But that's not Paul's battle. Paul's battle was something completely different. Paul was fighting a church that once he started to have Gentiles come into the church, some of the leaders, including James, sent some representatives that went behind Paul and said, no, Paul's right. Yes, you're justified by faith, but you have to be Jewish. Therefore, you have to be circumcised. Therefore, you have to follow the food laws. No bacon double cheeseburgers. No Red Lobster visits. You have to maintain all those food laws. Paul's response was, wait a minute. As soon as you make Christianity anything other than the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and you start making also about circumcision, what food you eat, what clothes you wear, then you've added to it, and it ceases to become uniquely Christian. Christianity is all about grace, is all about the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, not what I wear. You can be exceedingly moral and exceedingly good, and yet not have the saving grace of Jesus Christ. It's about more than just a moral code. It's about having life within. So let's talk about this supposed difference between Paul and James very briefly. In Galatians 3:6, Paul writes, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. He's quoting Genesis 15 there. This seems to contrast James 2:18, where James writes, was not our father Abraham justified by works? Paul asserts that a man is justified not by observing the works of the law, but through the faith of Jesus Christ. That's in 2:16 of Galatians. Where James counters with a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone. Both, however, agree that the law still must be kept. Paul writes that in Galatians 5. James writes that in chapter 2, verse 10. Both authors tell you that the monotheism, the oneness of God, is of vital importance. James writes it in 2:19. Paul writes it in Galatians 3:28. And both of them write that if you want to be an heir to the kingdom of God, that it's linked to participating in his promise, which is grace. That's Galatians 3:29 and James 2:5. And both authors thoroughly ground the responsibility of Christians in the words of Jesus from Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself. When we approach James and we approach Paul, what you have is two people that have a different audience and are fighting a different battle. And so when we have that, we need to remember that they're not really fighting each other, but are both approaching the topic from just a little different perspective. And Martin Luther had his own battle whatsoever that's not going on today. So I would agree you're not justified by faith alone, or maybe better put, if you have a faith that's not seen in what you do, it's not seen in your actions, your words, your steps, then maybe you don't have the faith you think you do. May your life match your words. May your outside match the reality of the inside. Or as Jesus put it in Matthew, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Anyway, I hope that helps as you start to go through James. Hey, join us next week. We'll be in 1 John. And 1 John is a little different than you think. It's not answering the problem that you think it is. And I hope you join us next week. Hey, like us, subscribe to us, and please send us a question. We want to answer your questions. Maybe we're not always going to be right, but we hope to further your understanding. So we'll see you back here next week.